physical activity guidelines, it states that we should be doing at least 150 minutes to 300 minutes of aerobic physical activity. I would lobby this and argue against it, saying that we should actually be doing a minimum of 300 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous, not just, aerobic physical activity. I think the evidence is there to show that, moderate to vigorous physical activity is actually better than just aerobic based training at 150 minutes per week.
Yeah, there's some nomenclature problems in the guidelines. So like when you read them, they're like, yeah, you can do any combination of 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity sort of activity. And but they always call it aerobic activity. And to further specify, they say you need to do 500 to 1,000 MET minutes of aerobic activity per week. And then it's like, from a public health standpoint, it's like, how many people know what a MET minute is? Like, even in the fitness space, like if you ask most professionals, what is a MET minute? They're like, And so, there's problems with sort of the specific application of those guidelines. And I would agree with you that if you had to come out with like a public health recommendation for, what is a sort of optimal target for, in this case, we'll call it conditioning, right? Because it could be aerobic, it could be anaerobic interval training, it could be, it doesn't necessarily need to be purely aerobic. It would probably be closer to 300 minutes per week. And you would want people to be active on most days, and you would want those sessions of exercise to be fairly long. Although, again, the current scientific consensus, the supporting document for the physical activity guideline, says pretty much any type of activity at any duration is going to be helpful. That is true, but again, you're really trying to figure out, well, what are the optimal targets that we're looking for? And I would agree that more is better. There seems to be this dose-dependent relationship between the amount of exercise volume that people do and the sort of disease-modifying process. So, for example, there's a dose-dependent relationship between exercise volume and resting blood pressure lowering effect. It's like the more you do, the better. Same thing for blood sugar control. Same thing for reduction in heart disease risk or incidence of major adverse cardiac event. And so, the 150 minutes per week is a target that still most people aren't hitting. If it was 300 minutes, even less people would be hitting it. And so I guess, I kind of feel for the people making up these guidelines, because they're like, they probably want more too. But they're like, well, what can we actually recommend that people are going to do,
Yeah. And I think they also don't want to scare people off, because what I think as well might be happening, this is just my observational data, is they see the word 150 minutes and then they think to themselves, there is no way I'm going to hit that, so I'm just not going to do anything at all. So there's that side. But then there's also the word physical activity. Example, my mother and I fight a lot about this. I'm like, did you go I bought them weight vests. They haven't used them yet. So that's what we're going to be. That's the next fight in December when I head home. But I said to Mum, did you exercise? And she's like, Louisa, I did the gardening. I put the clothes on the line. What more do you want me to do? I'm like, that's not exercise. That's just,
it's
daily
physical activity. Sure.
Yeah. And so that's as well. Do you think that there is a problem there?
Yeah, I think, and again, this comes down to like wording and verbiage and again, just public sort of health campaigns. The guidelines do recommend, again, for the conditioning component, the 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity, which again, we should just call conditioning. But they effectively don't delineate between physical exercise, like physical activity, and exercise. Exercise being a sort of specialized form of physical activity that is purpose-driven, tends to be repetitive, tends to be designated to improve aspects of physical performance and physical health, whereas physical activity is more just movement, right? And so gardening it's movement. It's, it is physical activity, but it's not exercise. And the biggest issue with gardening, I don't want to harp on gardening too much, because gardening seems like a fun activity.
Right, though, by the way, therapeutic activity.
Yeah. It's just that the sort of rate limiting steps of how, like, as far as how much you can garden or how hard you can garden doesn't necessarily drive the fitness adaptations that we know share and overlap with disease modifying processes. So for example, any type of conditioning that actually improves cardiorespiratory fitness, those underlying processes that actually lead to an improvement in like VO2 max, for example, those things, it's the same underlying processes that reduce resting blood pressure, reduce your resting heart rate, reduce your sort of fasting blood glucose. Whereas activity, any sort of activity, does have a little bit of benefit, but it's not to the same magnitude or same degree. And so I think, even when you look at like the metabolic compendium chart. So if you were hard up on the 500 to 1,000 minutes per week of physical activity, you'll find gardening in there. You'll find, all sorts of different activities. But I think there should be a better sort of designation between, all right, here's generalized physical activity, which is good, great, do it. But you also need to do formalized exercise. On the other hand, that could create a barrier to folks if they're like, well, this is an exercise. Should I do it anyway? It's like, well, you should do it all. I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking.